Bennett Diamond stood on the launch pad, gazing up at the sleek spacecraft that would soon carry him to Mars. The Ares 3, humanity's most ambitious space mission yet. It would take Bennett further from Earth than any human had ever ventured before. As he stared at the ship, a mix of emotions churned inside him: excitement, pride, but above all, an enduring grief and the bitter taste of vengeance. 8 years ago, his older brother Arthur had died on a lunar mission when faulty equipment caused a catastrophic failure. Arthur had been a hero, the first to return to the moon in decades. His death was a devastating blow to the Diamond family and the entire nation. In the intervening years, as Bennett followed in his brother's footsteps to become an astronaut, he couldn't shake the suspicion that Arthur's death was no accident. He had pored over the technical reports, analyzed every frame of footage from Arthur's final moments. The official investigation blamed a manufacturing defect in the life support system. But something didn't add up. The defect was too convenient, the timing of the failure too perfect to be coincidence. Bennett had devoted himself to unraveling the mystery. Between grueling training sessions, he worked his NASA connections, called in favors, chased down every lead no matter how thin. Gradually, a picture began to emerge of a shadowy private space consortium that viewed NASA as a rival, of officials who had opposed the lunar mission, of potential motives for sabotage. But he still lacked a smoking gun, hard evidence to prove his conspiracy theory and get justice for Arthur. Now, as he prepared to embark on his own mission, Bennett knew this was his last chance. He had to find answers on Mars. In the months leading up to the launch, he had secretly installed his own monitoring equipment to capture and transmit data that could expose any foul play. If someone tried to sabotage the Ares 3 the way they had sabotaged his brother's ship, this time there would be proof. The call came to board and Bennett marched resolutely toward the spacecraft. As he buckled into his acceleration couch, he thought of his brother. "I'll find out the truth, Arthur," he whispered. "I promise." The last face Bennett saw before the hatch sealed was the cherubic blonde visage of Sam Trenton, the head of BrightSkies Aerospace. The very consortium he suspected had a hand in destroying Arthur's ship. Trenton's blue eyes glinted as he waved farewell. Was that a menacing smirk playing at the corners of his mouth? Bennett itched to radio mission control and voice his suspicions about Trenton. But without evidence, he knew he'd only sound like a paranoid lunatic. Instead, he ran through his equipment checklist with the ground crew, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil and steely determination. The voice of launch control crackled over the comm, T-minus 50 seconds. Bennett took a deep breath, mentally prepping for the bone-crushing acceleration that would propel him into space. He could feel his heart pounding, palms sweating inside his spacesuit gloves. But it wasn't the physical stress of launch that made his pulse race. It was the knowledge that he was about to follow Arthur into the void, that he was embarking on a quest not just for scientific glory, but to bring his brother's killers to justice. No matter what happened, he vowed, the truth would come out. If it cost him his own life, so be it. This time, the Diamond story would have a different ending. The countdown continued. Bennett closed his eyes, picturing his parents, his remaining siblings, his fiancée Jane. He had recorded farewell messages for all of them, just in case. T-minus 30 seconds. A wave of fear threatened to engulf him, but he pushed it away. He couldn't afford doubt or hesitation. Not when he was so close to his goal. He had trained for this moment physically and mentally for years. He was as ready as he would ever be. 15 seconds. Ignition sequence start. The ship hummed to life around him, immense engines thundering. The whole space frame vibrated like a living thing eager to break free of its earthly bonds. 10, 9, 8. Bennett gripped the armrests. This was it, the point of no return. In a few moments, he would be hurtling into the unknown. Whatever challenges or dangers awaited him out there, he would face them head-on. For himself, for his mission, for Arthur. 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have liftoff of the Ares 3. Crushing G-forces slammed Bennett back into his seat as the ship clawed its way toward the heavens on a pillar of blinding flame. The blue sky receded to purple, then black as they knifed through the atmosphere. Stars blazed to life in the viewport, They were in space. Despite everything, a thrill ran through Bennett. He had done it. He was an astronaut at last, following his lifelong dream, following Arthur. But his triumph was short-lived. A faint whistling noise reached his ears, barely perceptible over the roar of the engines. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He knew that sound, had heard it in his nightmares for 8 years. It was the sound of air escaping where it shouldn't, the precursor to disaster. No, not again. Couldn't be happening again. Mission Control, I have an anomaly, he reported, fighting to keep his voice steady. Sounds like an air leak, possibly the O2 line. Before Mission Control could respond, a loud bang shook the spacecraft. Alarms shrilled and acrid smoke billowed from the instrument panels. This was no manufacturing defect. It was deliberate, calculated. Bennett's eyes stung and his head swam as he struggled to radio for help. The anomaly had struck at the worst possible moment. All his careful preparations, all his monitoring equipment were useless now. The truth would die with him, sucked out into the merciless vacuum with his last breath. Just like Arthur. As blackness closed in, it wasn't fear that filled Bennett's fading thoughts, but a despairing rage. Once again, the enemy had outsmarted him. Once again, the diamonds would be robbed of justice. With his last moment of consciousness, Bennett reached for the locket velcroed to his wrist, the one that held a picture of Arthur and the scrawled list of suspects' names he had compiled over the years. One name stood out, mocking him, Sam Trenton. That final, taunting smirk. The puzzle pieces locked into place with sickening clarity. Too late. It was all too late. His frozen fingers fumbled with the locket as the cabin spun around him. I'm sorry, Arthur, he thought as a peaceful coldness enveloped him. I tried. Then the void swallowed him, and he knew no more. 3,000 miles away in Houston, Jane Carmichael walked numbly out of Mission Control, barely hearing the flurry of frantic commands and emergency procedures being shouted around her. It had happened again. Despite all Bennett's precautions, despite everyone's fervent prayers and hopes, the diamond curse had struck a second time. Jane made it to the privacy of her car before dissolving into racking sobs. Bennett, the love of her life, her soulmate, was gone. Just like that, one moment soaring on the cusp of glory, the next blasted to atoms. When the tears finally subsided, Jane sat for a long time staring out the windshield, not really seeing the passing cars and people. Her mind replayed the last night she and Bennett spent together before he left for pre-launch quarantine. They had shared a quiet dinner, trying to keep the mood light, but an unspoken tension simmered between them. They both knew the risks, knew this could be the last time. Over dessert, Bennett had turned serious. Jane, if something happens to me out there, I need you to do something. Nothing's going to happen, she had insisted. You'll be fine, better than fine. You'll be amazing. Bennett had smiled sadly. I appreciate the optimism, but we have to face the possibility. So I need you to promise me. He took her hands in his. If I don't make it back, I need you to keep investigating. Keep pushing until you find the truth about what happened to Arthur. Can you do that for me? Jane's heart ached at the memory of that conversation. At the time, his request had seemed morbid, unnecessary. Now it was her last connection to him, her final promise. The crushing grief made it hard to breathe. But beneath it, a small, white-hot ember of anger took root. Bennett had been right all along. His death was no accident. And Jane would be damned if she let his killers get away with it. She didn't have Bennett's astronaut skills or NASA access. But she was a journalist, and a damn good one. She knew how to chase down leads, how to get people talking, how to ferret out secrets. Starting now, finding the truth would be her sole mission in life. She would pick up where Bennett left off. She would expose the rot he had died trying to uncover. She would get justice for him and Arthur, whatever it took, however long. Failure was not an option. Jane started the car. 2 months later, Jane sat in a cheap motel room, papers strewn across the bed, a half-eaten veggie burger abandoned on the nightstand. She rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the dull throb behind her eyes. She had been on the road for weeks now, meeting Bennett's contacts, tracking down reluctant witnesses, piecing together shreds of evidence. It was grueling, frustrating work. Dead ends and stonewalling at every turn. But slowly, painstakingly, a pattern was emerging. Unusual personnel changes preceding the doomed missions. Misplaced records and deleted emails. And over, the name BrightSkies Aerospace. The private space company had exploded onto the scene a few years back, flush with cash from shadowy investors, aggressively poaching talent from NASA. Their CEO, Sam Trenton, made no secret of his disdain for the government space program, denouncing it as bloated, risk-averse, and obsolete. "The future belongs to those who seize it," he was fond of saying. "And BrightSkies will seize it long before NASA finishes dusting off their moon rocks." The word in the industry was that BrightSkies was preparing to announce their own Mars mission, one that would preempt NASA's by months, if not years. A mission not bound by government oversight and safety protocols. Could BrightSkies really be so ruthless, so brazen, as to sabotage their rival to clear the way for their own triumph? The scope of the conspiracy seemed unthinkable. But the more Jane dug, the more convinced she became. It was the only scenario that made sense of all the missing pieces. She just needed proof. A smoking gun to take to the authorities. But all trails led back to Sam Trenton, and he had proved maddeningly elusive, always one step ahead of her, his secrets guarded by an army of lawyers and fixers. Jane glanced at the stack of Bennett's journals on the bed beside her. She had pored over them 100 times, searching for missed clues. His heartbreaking final entry before the launch, addressed to her, never failed to bring tears. "Remember, Jane, a good journalist never backs away from the truth, no matter how ugly it is. But do it carefully, okay? These people we're up against are powerful and ruthless. Watch your back and don't trust anyone. If it looks like I won't make it home to finish what I started, it's up to you. I'm counting on you. I love you." She had no illusions about the danger. The same people who killed Arthur and Bennett would have no compunction about silencing her too if she got too close. But she had been cautious, staying off the grid, never sleeping in the same place twice, varying her routines. She tried not to think about her family back home, how much she missed them, the cryptic message she had sent them when she first fled Houston, imploring them not to look for her or ask questions. It was safer for everyone that way. All that mattered now was the next lead, the next breakthrough that would blow this case wide open and bring Bennett's killers to account. Jane's phone pinged with an incoming message. A choking gasp escaped her as she read it. "Dinner tonight? I have a proposition you'll want to hear. Come alone. Tell no one. Sam Trenton." Jane's hand shook as she typed a response. It had to be a trap. Trenton knew she was on to him. He was luring her to tie up loose ends. But what if it wasn't? What if, against all odds, he was having a change of heart, ready to turn whistleblower? This could be the break she had prayed for all these long, lonely months on the road. She hesitated only a moment before hitting send. "See you at 8. Pier 39. Adrenaline humming, she began to prepare. The waterfront restaurant was all white tablecloths and tea lights, moneyed types sipping martinis against a backdrop of glittering night sea. Jane felt acutely out of place in her best attempts at business casual slacks and a neat blouse picked up at a thrift store that morning to replace her t-shirt and jeans. She scanned the room and immediately spotted Trenton, his golden hair shining like a beacon in a corner booth. She slid in across from him. "Ms. Carmichael," he greeted her, teeth flashing. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Trenton," Jane replied coolly. "What's this proposition?" "Straight to business." "I like that." Trenton signaled the waiter. "But first, a drink to toast new partnerships." As if on cue, a bottle of champagne appeared, the cork popping with a festive burst. Jane accepted a poured flute warily, watching Trenton over the bubbling rim. He raised his glass. "To the future," he declared, "and to setting the record straight about the past." Jane felt a flutter of hope as she clinked glasses and pretended to sip. Was he really going to come clean? Admit BrightSkies' role in sabotaging the Diamond missions? Trenton settled back, steepling his fingers. "Ms. Carmichael, you strike me as a woman of vision. Someone who understands that progress requires sacrifice. Who knows that sometimes to build something new, the old must be swept away. Is that what you call murdering two astronauts? Jane asked tightly. Sweeping away the old? Trenton's genial mask slipped for just a second. Then he chuckled. Murder? Miss Carmichael, I'm wounded. It was nothing so crude. He leaned forward, voice silky. What happened to the diamonds was regrettable, but it was for the greater good, I assure you. NASA's time is past. Space exploration belongs in private hands now. Visionaries unbound by fear and red tape. You're saying you did it? Jane breathed. You're confessing? Confessing? Trenton sked. Such an ugly word. I'm offering you the inside story of the century, Ms. Carmichael. The exclusive of a lifetime. He placed a sleek folder on the table between them. In there you'll find enough to write your blockbuster exposé. Internal documents, financial records, the full sordid tale. Why? Jane whispered. Why give this to me? Trenton shrugged. Let's just say every story needs a narrator. I'd rather it be a sympathetic one. His eyes pierced hers, mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Play your cards right, and when BrightSkies makes history on Mars, you'll be our embedded correspondent. The world will see our triumph through your eyes. Jane's head swam. To hold the proof of Bennett's suspicions at last, the vindication he died pursuing, it was all she had worked for. But to collude with his killers, allow them to spin the narrative. So what do you say? Trenton extended a hand. Partners. The restaurant seemed to recede into a blur, narrowing to Trenton's magnetic stare. This was the moment it all led to. The pact that would decide her fate, shape the future. Heart pounding, Jane reached for the folder and Trenton's outstretched hand. Jane's fingers closed around the folder, but at the last moment she snatched her hand back from Trenton's grasp as if burned. No, she said hoarsely.
No partnership.
No deal. She clutched the folder to her chest. I'll write the story, but I'll write the truth. The whole ugly truth of what you and your company did. Trenton's eyes narrowed to slits. The genial mask fell away entirely, revealing something far colder and more calculating beneath. Unwise Miss Carmichael, he said softly. I'm offering you a gilded future. You really want to make an enemy of me and BrightSkies? Jane stood on shaky legs, backing away from the booth. Bennett and Arthur Diamond were worth 1,000 of you, she spat. When the world hears what you did to them, you and BrightSkies will be toxic. You'll be finished. The world will never hear it, Trenton said with chilling certainty. Not from you. His hand moved beneath the table. Jane didn't stop to see what he was reaching for. She turned and ran, shoving through the startled waitstaff and diners, the folder with its precious, damning contents hugged tight. She burst out of the restaurant into the cool night air and pelted down the pier, strappy heels slipping on the wet boards. Behind her came the unmistakable pop-pop of silenced gunfire and the whiz of near misses. Jane veered off the pier, plunging into the dark alley maze of the wharf district. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get away, get to safety, protect the evidence at all costs. But Trenton's men were right behind her, their footfalls and barked orders echoing ever closer. She couldn't outrun them forever. Jane skidded around a corner and found herself in a trash-strewn dead end. She spun, heart lurching, as her pursuers' shadows stretched long into the alley mouth. This was it. The folder's secrets would die with her. Jane! The voice from above made her jump. A winch line unspooled from the fire escape overhead. Crouched on the landing was a familiar face. Ethan Harding, Bennett's best friend and fellow astronaut candidate. They had washed out of training together, the last people to see Bennett alive. Grab on, Ethan urged. Jane lunged for the line, folder gripped in one hand. Ethan hauled her up just as Trenton's goons swarmed the alley below. Bullets pinged off the metal grating. Ethan pulled Jane through an open window into a darkened loft space. You okay? He panted. Jane could only nod, adrenaline still searing her veins. How did you find me? How did you know? Ethan gave a rueful smile. I've been tailing you since Houston. Figured you could use some backup. He nodded to the folder. That what I think it is? Jane hugged it defensively. Trenton tried to cut a deal. Fed me just enough to hang himself. It's all here. Everything we need to nail him and Bright Skies. Ethan blew out a breath. You know this isn't over, right? They'll never stop hunting us now. I know, said Jane. She met his eyes. But we have to try. We owe it to Bennett and Arthur. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, let's finish this. For the diamonds. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Royce? It's me. We're ready for extraction. And notify the Attorney General. We've got a hell of a story for her. Jane sagged against the wall as Ethan spoke, the magnitude of what had just happened washing over her. They had done it. The proof Bennett died for was safe. His sacrifice, Arthur's sacrifice, wouldn't be in vain. Trenton and Bright Skies might still be out there, might still have their fangs in the system. Taking them down for good would be a long fight. But Jane swore in that moment that she would see it through to the end, whatever it took. The diamonds would have justice. The truth would out. Ethan finished his call and turned to her with fire in his eyes, that same righteous determination. He held out his hand. Partners. This time, Jane didn't hesitate. She clasped his hand firmly in her own. Partners, let's burn them down.